In the mid-18th century, England was still a deeply rural territory. Work was done entirely by hand, tools were rudimentary, and people's time followed the rhythm of the sun and the changing seasons. At that moment, barely around 15% of the population lived in cities. However, just 150 years later, reality was radically transformed. Nearly 85% of Britons already lived in urban areas. The countryside lost population, the factory gained space, and daily routines stopped obeying nature to submit to the implacable rhythm of machines. In little more than a century, a strictly agrarian country became the first industrial society in the world, a transformation that forever redefined how humanity produces, works, and lives. Before this change erupted in 1760, the British economy was essentially agrarian and artisanal production predominated. Textiles and clothing were manufactured inside homes. Entire families participated in the process. They spun wool, wove, sewed, and sold their own products. The artisan mastered every stage of production, from the raw material to the finished item. This structure began to change profoundly due to political and economic decisions in rural areas. Throughout the 18th century, the English Parliament authorized the enclosure of common lands. Areas that were previously used collectively by peasants for their subsistence passed into the private control of large landowners. Many of these lands were converted into pastures for the massive breeding of sheep, whose wool supplied the growing demand of the textile trade. Without access to land, thousands of peasants lost their livelihoods and had no choice but to look for work in the cities. At the same time, agriculture was undergoing a technical revolution with crop rotation, livestock breeding improvements, and more efficient land use. Food production increased and the population grew, but with the countryside privatized and mechanized, entire villages emptied. The path toward urban centers was not a choice for these families, but a harsh necessity for survival. England met the perfect conditions for this historical change. Following the glorious revolution of the previous century, the country enjoyed political stability and a consolidated parliamentary system. Global maritime trade had allowed for the accumulation of vast amounts of capital, while its colonial empire guaranteed both consumer markets and a steady supply of raw materials. Furthermore, the English subsoil was immensely rich in mineral coal and iron ore. In 1765, James Watt perfected the steam engine, making it much more efficient and applicable to mass production. The principle was simple but revolutionary. Coal heated water, the steam generated moved pistons, and that mechanical movement could be applied to different machineries. The world's energy stopped depending exclusively on human strength, animal labor, or the current of rivers. The textile industry was the first to incorporate these innovations. Spinning machines and power looms drastically expanded production capacity. What was previously done in a domestic and family environment became concentrated in large buildings specifically designed to house machinery. The modern factory was born. Inside it, work was fragmented and divided into specific stages. The worker no longer created a complete object. Now he executed a single, simple, and repetitive task countless times throughout the day. Production became standardized, continuous, and remarkably cheaper. The artisan who mastered the whole trade gave way to the factory worker who knew only a minimal part of the process. Work lost its individual face, and time became strictly industrial, measured by clocks and sirens. The speed of the world also transformed. In 1829, on the railway line between Liverpool and Manchester, the rocket locomotive, designed by George Stephenson, crossed the rails before an astonished crowd. People who had never seen anything move so fast without the use of horses stood completely motionless, watching in silence or backing away in fear. That machine was not just a new means of transportation, it was the living symbol of a new era.
The world had changed speed and would never go back. The growth of factories drove an accelerated and chaotic urban development. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool expanded at a pace never seen before. Chimneys and industrial warehouses completely altered the physical landscape, while canals and railroads integrated production centers directly with maritime ports. The steam locomotive consolidated itself as the engine of commerce, transporting tons of coal, iron, and manufactured goods, strengthening internal trade and accelerating urbanization. By the mid-19th century, more than half of Britain's already inhabited cities. However, industrial cities were marked by profound and painful contrasts. While production increased and national wealth grew to historic levels, working-class neighborhoods became densely populated spaces that lacked adequate infrastructure, clean water, or sewage systems. Coal pollution permanently darkened the sky and seriously affected the health of the population. Inside the factories, conditions were inhuman. Working days of 14 to 16 hours were the norm. Women received barely half the male salary for doing the exact same job. Worse still, children as young as 6 were employed in coal mines because their small bodies adapted to the narrow tunnels where adults could not enter. These children spent 12 hours a day in absolute darkness, pushing heavy carts. In the beginnings of industrialization, there were no minimum ages to work, no shift limits, no protection against accidents. There was only the extreme need of the workers and the economic profit of those who hired them.
This first industrial revolution fragmented and redefined the social structure, consolidating two clearly differentiated classes. On one side, the industrial bourgeoisie, owner of the factories, machines, and capital. On the other, the proletariat, composed of urban workers who depended exclusively on selling their labor power to survive. This deep disparity did not take long to generate strong social tensions. In 1811, in the Yorkshire region, groups of organized workers invaded textile factories at night to break power looms with hammers. This movement, known as Luddist, did not attack technology out of simple ignorance, but protested against hunger, unemployment, and the drastic drop in wages brought about by automation without alternatives for the worker. The British government's response was extremely harsh, classifying the destruction of machines as a serious crime, punished with severe penalties. Despite the repression, the labor struggle continued to evolve. In the 1830s, the Chartist movement demanded the political participation of the popular classes and better living conditions. Workers' associations began to transform into the first organized unions, pressing socially to achieve labor regulations and the reduction of grueling working hours. Parallelly, thinkers of the era analyzed the new economic system. Intellectuals like Karl Marx argued that the worker produced a much greater value than what he actually received in his salary, and that this difference, called surplus value, became the profit of the owner. Slowly, throughout the 19th century, the first labor laws began to emerge, limiting working hours and restricting child exploitation. Industrialization completely transformed the global balance of power. England consolidated itself as the main economic and military power of the 19th century, remaining for decades as the only fully industrialized economy on the planet. However, this model did not stay stuck on the island. Countries like France, Belgium, Germany, and the United States followed the same path in the subsequent decades. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, the young American nation would surpass England itself as the largest industrial power in the world. The model inaugurated on British soil established the economic patterns that ended up becoming global: large-scale production, systematic division of labor, intensive use of fossil fuels, and unprecedented urban growth.
The first industrial revolution changed the very base of human civilization, and the urban, technological, and labor structure it built remains, to this day, the foundations of the modern world.